They buried the last Murphy son under moonlight. No priest, no rites, no one from the town dared attend. Just 4 men in black coats, moving like shadows, their faces hidden, their silence louder than mourning. But the real funeral began decades before that. Before the graves, before the bloodline, before anyone even whispered the word curse. You see, this wasn't about death, it was about payment. And someone, something, was collecting. What you're about to hear is not a legend. It's not a ghost story passed around campfires to scare children. This is something far more dangerous. It's the kind of truth that crawls through history books wearing the mask of coincidence. It's a design buried so deep into the bones of a forgotten American town that no one dares touch it. Not even the state. 7 sons, all dead at 25, not 24, not 26, 25, different years, different causes, but the exact same age, each one marked, each one prepared, each one expected. And if you think that's superstition, then tell me why the Pennsylvania State Archives sealed over 300 pages on the Murphy case in 1884, permanently restricted. Tell me why every coroner, every investigator, every surviving witness either vanished or died within 5 years. And tell me why the diary of Dr. Ezra Caldwell, physician to 4 of the 7 sons, was locked in a Catholic seminary vault for 117 years. If you're not afraid yet, good. Fear clouds judgment. And to see clearly, you're going to have to walk with me through coal dust, blood, and silence. This story doesn't begin in a mine. It begins in a ledger. Because power, true power, hides not in shadows, but in paperwork, in quiet agreements, in signatures signed in rooms you'll never enter. And in Millfield, Pennsylvania, where this story unfolds, the company didn't just own the land. They owned time, life, memory, and bloodlines. They called it the Settlement Program. But beneath the polished name was something ancient, primal, a covenant. Sheamus Murphy arrived in Millfield with nothing but a promise and a letter. He thought it was opportunity, but it was inheritance. You're going to see how one man's ambition became his family's execution, how children were born not into freedom, but into debt, and how that debt could only be paid in the flesh of sons. Now lean in, because after this story, you won't be the same man you were before. They say the devil doesn't need to make deals anymore. He just watches contracts get signed. In the fall of 1846, Sheamus Murphy signed such a contract, though he didn't know it. The ink was real. But the cost, that was spiritual, invisible, binding. The letter he carried from Ireland was addressed to Josiah Bentley, Keystone Coal Iron's operations manager, a man whose name barely survived the margins of history, yet who wielded power that outlasted kings. Bentley was no ordinary foreman. He wasn't born poor, nor rich, but made himself something worse, useful. He understood a truth few men dare speak aloud: control people's survival, and you own their souls. His innovations in labor management weren't about efficiency, they were about obedience. Millfield wasn't a town, it was a containment zone. Its residents, test subjects. You have to understand, the 1840s weren't just a time of famine in Ireland, they were a time of pruning. Bloodlines were being selected, not saved. Some were meant to vanish. Others were meant to serve. Sheamus didn't just escape starvation. He was chosen. By whom? That's the part that history scrubbed out. But the letter bore a seal, charcoal black, embossed with an Ouroboros and a Gaelic inscription translating to, "What ends shall begin again." He was already property before he ever stepped foot in America. The moment Sheamus set foot on Keystone soil, the company began collecting data. Not wages, but patterns. How quickly he adapted, how loyal he became, what he feared, who he loved. His marriage to Margaret O'Connell wasn't just a union of hearts, it was the first step in a long-planned genetic arrangement. You see, the company didn't just want workers, it wanted inheritance vessels. Men and women who would birth the next generation of labor-bound offspring, tied by blood and ink to a system older than the company itself. Margaret became Pitane, Raynant 6 months after arriving. The moment was celebrated in town, but behind closed doors Bentley documented it in a separate ledger, one not stored in any office. It simply read, Subject A1, cycle initiated, monitor for pattern alignment. That first child would be Patrick, the first to die, the first to pay. But you must remember, this was never about Patrick. It was about what he represented. Each Murphy son was a tally mark, a countdown, a pattern repeating with surgical precision. And in Millfield, patterns were prophecy. Everything was watched, everything was written, everything was on schedule. The Murphy home on Elm Street looked like every other in Millfield. 2 stories, ash-grey siding, coal smoke rising from a narrow chimney. But inside, something stirred that couldn't be explained by drafty floors or creaking beams. Margaret once told a visiting midwife that the house listened. She meant it literally. Conversations would echo when they shouldn't. Cold spots would form in the hallway near the nursery. And most unsettling of all were the whispers. Faint, rhythmic, never quite intelligible, but unmistakably human. The company dismissed her claims, calling them hysteria. Dr. Caldwell prescribed laudanum, but Margaret knew better. She wasn't mad. The house had ears. When Patrick was born, Margaret felt a sense of dread, not from the boy, but from the quiet. He didn't cry for nearly a full minute after delivery. The midwife, pale and shaking, told Sheamus that the cord had been wound around his neck 3 times, yet somehow he had no bruises. No marks, no sign of trauma, just wide black eyes that stared up at her like he remembered her. As Patrick grew, the boy exhibited talents that unnerved the townspeople. By age 5, he could recite passages from his father's company ledgers, verbatim, not read them, recite them. He spoke Gaelic fluently despite never being taught, and he sometimes knew things he shouldn't, like which neighbor would fall ill or when a shaft would collapse, down to the hour. Sheamus and Margaret kept this quiet, fearing what the company might do. But Dr. Caldwell took notes. He wrote, "The boy is synchronized." That word appears over 24 times in the private journals Caldwell kept hidden in a locked cabinet beneath his clinic's floorboards. Synchronized. Not sick. Not possessed. Synchronized. As if Patrick were aligning with something ancient, something structural, something planned. By the age of 10, Patrick stopped talking about the future. Instead, he began asking strange questions. What happens if the ledger burns? What if I don't go down on my birthday? Would they come anyway? Margaret brushed these off as childhood curiosity, but deep inside she began waking from sleep with a wet face, not remembering dreams but feeling the presence of someone at the foot of her bed, watching, waiting, like a debt collector. And that's what this really was, wasn't it? A debt. You were taught debts are numbers, but some debts are names. Blood, time, cycles. And when one family is bound to pay, they don't get to choose the currency. Only the due date. By the time Patrick turned 16, he had already begun to die. Not in the way the body dies, but the way a man does when he senses the hourglass has been turned upside down and no one told him when. His shoulders grew heavy, not from labor, but from knowledge. He would walk past the church without crossing himself, stare too long at the coal trains like he could hear something whispering between the wheels. He began to sketch symbols on his bedroom walls. Circles inside circles, with slashes through them, like seals being broken. Margaret scrubbed them away, but they would return, always darker, always deeper. One night, Patrick stood outside the company store for 3 hours, unmoving. When asked why, he simply said, "I was practicing stillness." When his father demanded he explain, Patrick answered, "Stillness is how you delay the hand. Movement invites attention." Sheamus was no fool. He had seen enough strange deaths in Millfield to know that Patrick was becoming a part of the machinery, not metaphorically, but literally. His life had begun to mirror the cycle: work, silence, compliance, erasure. He wasn't raising a son, he was watching a countdown. And the worst part? He had agreed to it. He had signed. It was during this time that Dr. Caldwell attempted something forbidden. He tried to intervene. The good doctor was no stranger to whispers. He'd treated pregnant women whose dreams mirrored Margaret's, attended to young men who reported being followed by shadows with no source. He'd seen too much, he knew too much, and he'd decided, finally, to act. He began gathering evidence, interviewing former employees, copying ledgers, extracting samples of coal dust that, when examined under microscope, appeared to contain trace compounds not native to Pennsylvania soil. He found documents referring to something called the Stone Doctrine, a company philosophy never made public, stored only in a locked file in the town's land office. Caldwell believed Patrick's fate could be stopped, but on February 14, 1868, exactly 1 month before Patrick's 21st birthday, Caldwell's clinic burned to the ground in the dead of night. No patients were injured, no adjacent buildings were touched, just the clinic, just the cabinet beneath the floor, and yet Caldwell survived. When asked what caused the fire, he said only this: "I tried to change the cycle, and the cycle noticed. There are things in this world that punish interference with silence." On the eve of Patrick's 21st birthday, the house on Elm Street fell unnaturally quiet, not peaceful, quiet, the kind of silence that feels placed like someone drained the sound from the air. Margaret lit candles in every room, her hands trembling as she moved. She wasn't religious anymore, not really, but she prayed. Not to God. She didn't believe he was watching Millfield. She prayed to anything that might listen, anything that might intervene. Patrick didn't sleep that night. He stood in the yard with a lantern, eyes fixed on the mountains, his breath rising like smoke into the still air. He told his mother, "They've already written it down. The exact moment, the exact way. But I wonder, if I stand here long enough, will they hesitate?" That was the question that haunted Margaret. What is they? Dr. Caldwell visited the house that morning. He insisted on checking Patrick's pulse, his breath, his pupils. Everything was normal, too normal. He sat Patrick down at the table and asked a question no other doctor would dare. "Do you know what's coming?" Patrick looked at him, steady. "They'll call it an accident, but it won't be. They'll say it was random. But it's planned. It's always planned." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "If I don't make it back today, bury me next to the oak tree behind the chapel. No priests, no hymns, just dirt and stone. Simple. As it was before names were invented." Caldwell took the note and said nothing. Patrick turned to his father, who had been watching from the doorway, hollow and quiet. "You made the deal," he said. "Not accusing, not cruel, just factual. You didn't know what it would cost, but you still signed." Sheamus didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was the confession. At 2:17 p.m. the mine exploded. But what few ever learned, what wasn't in the papers, the ledgers or the town records, was what Patrick S.'d before it happened. Every surviving miner swore it was the same. He looked at his pocket watch, smiled and whispered, "Time's up." Not for him, for us. He wasn't warning them. He was declaring continuation. The cycle had turned once more, another stone laid, another debt paid. And what came next was not grief, it was inventory. After Patrick's death, Margaret began hearing footsteps upstairs, even when everyone was downstairs. Not heavy, not rushed, just slow, measured, deliberate, like someone pacing, waiting, the kind of sound that turns a house into a coffin. Sheamus, meanwhile, became obsessed with the family ledger, not the company's but their own, birthdays, illnesses, minor injuries, patterns. He started marking the boys' heights on the wall more often, studying growth like a scientist tracking mutations. He stopped drinking, stopped speaking, just numbers, always numbers. One night Margaret caught him writing 25 over and over in the margins of the family Bible, dozens of times, until the pen tore the page. But it was Thomas, Patrick's younger brother, who saw the signs most clearly. He never spoke at his brother's funeral, never cried. He just watched the casket lower into the earth and whispered, "That's one." Margaret shivered when she heard it, like he was counting something inevitable. By 17, Thomas was smarter than most of the supervisors at the mine. He avoided them, spent his time in the town library, what little there was of it. He read newspapers from other counties, mining reports, obituaries. He wasn't looking for information. He was looking for rhythms, and he found them. 3 other families, different towns, all company-owned, each with male heirs dying at 25, the same birth spacing, the same eerie dreams reported by the mothers, the same promises of promotion weeks before the deaths. Thomas started calling them the inheritance deaths. Not suicides, not accidents, scheduled terminations. He went to Father McKenna with what he'd found. The priest listened silently, then handed Thomas a single page from an old Irish text. No title, no author, just one passage circled in red ink. From seed to stone, the line must yield. The 7th of 7 seals is flesh-mad, is still. When Thomas asked what it meant, the priest said, "Some debts are taken from a man's coin, others from his blood. But there is a third kind, boy, the kind that pays with future." That was the last time Thomas entered the church. He began sleeping in short bursts, eating only when watched, always scanning the corners of rooms, always checking shadows for shape. He wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of pattern recognition, because once you see the web, you're no longer a fly. You become bait. Thomas began leaving the house through the window, not because he had something to hide, but because he knew someone was watching the front door. It wasn't paranoia. It was preservation. He had read enough to know the pattern was triggered by awareness. Once a subject understood what was happening. The clock began, and Thomas had been studying for years. He stopped using his real name at the library, burned his letters, spoke in code to his few remaining friends. He wasn't afraid of being killed, he was afraid of being claimed. There's a difference. You can fight a man, you can't fight a system that remembers your blood. By 1872, Thomas had built a secret archive, hidden behind a false wall in the cellar beneath McBride's tavern. It contained maps, letters, ledger pages stolen from his father's office, and newspaper clippings from as far as Missouri and Kentucky, all showing patterns of deaths in company towns tied to the same age, the same circumstances, the same eerie calm before catastrophe. In one letter from a mine in Ohio, a mother described her son waking up at 3:33 a.m. every night for a week before his death. In another, a man reported seeing an identical figure, tall, wearing a brimmed hat, no face, outside his window on the night his younger brother was killed in a mine collapse. Thomas circled each of these similarities, labeling them symptoms of contract maturity. He wasn't researching anymore, he was preparing. One night, Margaret found a letter on her kitchen table. It wasn't addressed to anyone, no signature, just a sentence written in Patrick's handwriting. "He's next. It's already been counted." The paper smelled faintly of sulfur. Margaret collapsed. When she awoke, she told Sheamus, "They don't kill them all at once. They collect like taxes, one generation at a time." Thomas wasn't home. He wouldn't be for 3 days. When he finally turned, his coat was torn, his boots covered in ash, his eyes glassy from something he wouldn't describe. He said only this: "There's a chapel in the woods, 10 miles east. The roof is gone. The altar is black stone, no cross, no icon, just 7 candles, all burned to the base, all dead cold, but the wax was still wet." Some structures aren't built for worship. They're built for accounting. Thomas didn't sleep indoors after that. He said the walls had started whispering. He built a small shelter behind the house, in the far corner of the yard beneath a crooked birch tree that never bloomed. It wasn't about fear, it was strategy. "They can't enter what isn't counted," he told his mother. "Rooms are part of the ledger, but the land still resists." Margaret begged him to stop digging, to stop asking questions, to stop looking for meaning where none could be safely known. But Thomas didn't just want answers. He wanted revenge. He believed Patrick had been sacrificed knowingly, by men who had traded their children's futures for temporary protection, not just Sheamus, but others, elders, supervisors, priests, men who had once received the same letter Sheamus did long ago, men who stayed silent because the price was always the same, one son, per line, per generation. Thomas began cataloguing the deaths across Millfield going back to 1824. He noticed that every 11 years, exactly 3 young men died on or near their 25th birthday, always from different families, but always families linked to the original settlement program. He mapped them out, each death point aligned in concentric circles, like an ancient ritual diagram, and at the center of every circle, Keystone's land office, a building no one entered unless invited, a building with no windows on the upper floor, a building that had reportedly never needed renovations, despite being over 50 years old. Thomas was nearing his own birthday now. Every morning, he would etch another tally mark into the side of his makeshift shelter. One day, Margaret asked what they meant. "They're not for how many days I have left," he said. "They're for how many watchers pass in the night." Watchers, that was his word, not ghosts, not spirits, not men. Watchers, entities that appeared in his peripheral vision, but vanished when he turned. Shapes that cast no shadow, but stood taller than the fences. Eyes that gleamed like coal dust in lamplight. Always watching, always waiting, never intervening. On the morning of his 25th birthday, Margaret woke to find Thomas gone. No note, no sound, no trace. But behind the birch tree, etched into the dirt, were 7 circles, each one larger than the last. At the center, a single handprint burned into the ground. They never found the body, because this time the pattern didn't take him. He stepped into it. They searched for Thomas for 12 days. The miners combed the woods. The sheriff organized posses. Even Sheamus, whose eyes had grown sunken and strange, dragged the cold creek beds by hand. But the truth was clear from the start. Thomas hadn't vanished. He had been collected. Dr. Caldwell was the only one who dared to say it aloud. He told Margaret quietly, "This wasn't a disappearance. It was a retrieval. The pattern was broken, and the system responded." He showed her his personal notes, drawings of strange black mold found near the birch tree, spores that seemed to pulse when exposed to heat, a type not found in any biological catalogue. He called it residual biological echo. She called it what it was, a stain left by a hand that doesn't bleed. In the weeks after Thomas vanished, Millfield changed. Subtly. The air tasted different, like dust layered on metal. The sky took on a bruised hue that never faded, even on cloudless days. And the silence? It wasn't natural anymore. It was installed. The town began to shrink, not physically, not visibly, but perceptibly. People moved slower. Time felt looped. Children forgot how to play. Even the coal trains ran quieter, as if the tracks themselves feared the noise. That winter, Sheamus stopped speaking altogether. He spent his days sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Margaret found him writing again, but this time, not numbers, symbols, repeating runes like loops. When she asked what they were, he whispered one word before lapsing into days of silence. Coordinates. Sheamus died 6 months later. Not from illness, not from age, from exhaustion. His organs simply stopped, as if they had fulfilled the contract and were permitted finally to rest. At his funeral, only 5 people showed up, and none dared carry his casket. It was left to Margaret to follow the procession alone. She placed no flowers, just a stone from the birch tree, a mark, a warning, a weight, and in her heart, a single truth hardened. This would not end with death. Because by now, she understood something horrifying. The curse wasn't supernatural, it was systemic. It wasn't haunting them, it was harvesting them. One son at a time, one cycle at a time, and she had another. His name was Michael. He was 15, and the clock had already started ticking. Michael was different from his brothers, quiet where Patrick was bold, gentle where Thomas was sharp. But silence does not mean safety. In Millfield, it meant ripeness. From the moment Thomas vanished, Michael became the center of something invisible but suffocating. Neighbors stopped speaking to him. Children crossed the street when he passed, and his teachers began to mark his assignments with a strange mix of fear and sympathy, as if they were grading a ghost they expected to vanish mid-term. At night, Margaret would hear him muttering in his sleep. Not nightmares, conversations, words she didn't understand, some Gaelic, some Latin, some unplaceable, words that bent her ears the wrong way, words that hummed like coal trains under pressure. When she asked Michael about the dreams, he didn't blink. "They're not dreams, Ma," he said. "They're briefings." She tried to homeschool him, tried to keep him from the town, from the whispers, from the company. But Millfield doesn't allow insulation. And soon, Keystone came calling. A man in a black coat, silver pin at his collar, neither a priest nor an officer, arrived at the Murphy doorstep. He introduced himself only as Mr. Elric, a representative from Heritage Oversight. No address, no office, just a black book with the family name engraved on the spine. He spoke politely, coldly, as if reading from a script. "We understand Michael is of age soon. We'd like to offer him advanced placement at the Keystone Training Annex, full scholarship, room, board, a future." Margaret refused, flatly, but the man didn't leave angry. He left smiling. "They always say no first," he said, gently closing the gate. "But cycles are patient, patterns always correct." That night, the temperature in the Murphy house dropped by 20 degrees. Every candle in the home extinguished itself at midnight. The following morning, Michael found urns and a box outside the front door. No name, no note, just 7 black stones. He placed them on the kitchen table in a circle, stared at them. "I think they want me to choose," he whispered. "No," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "They want you to accept. There's a difference." But Michael already knew that. And here, right here, viewer, pause. Because if you felt something shift in your gut, you're ready. Comment this below twice to lock in your transformation. Some debts are paid in silence. I remember the stones. Do it now, because from here on, it only gets darker. Michael began keeping a journal, not for memory, but for proof. He knew even then that no one would believe what was coming unless he left them something. Each page was coded, ciphers layered within symbols, diagrams of tunnels that didn't appear on any official mind maps. He documented the faces he saw in dreams, drew their proportions, tall, featureless, always standing in corners, never blinking, and always, always watching him. He titled the first page, Inheritance Manifest. At 16, Michael began walking the perimeter of Millfield at night. 3 miles in every direction, every night, rain or snow, sometimes barefoot. He said it was to interrupt the pattern's radius. No one knew what he meant. No one dared ask. Margaret found him one night kneeling in the woods, eyes closed, hands buried in the soil up to his wrists. "Michael," she cried, running to him. "What are you doing?" His voice was barely human when he answered, flat, distant, occupied. "They're underneath us, sleeping, but not unaware. They hear prayers through the roots. They hate prayer." From that night on, Margaret stopped praying aloud. Then came the drawings. Michael began to paint, on the walls, the floors, even his own arms. Spirals within triangles, keys without locks, doors with no handles, faces built from numbers. Margaret tried to wash them away, but they returned in different forms, etched in frost on windows, cracked into dried mud near the well, burned into the base of every tree near the house. One symbol appeared over and over, a vertical line crossed by 7 short strokes, ending in a teardrop-shaped hook. Dr. Caldwell saw it once, years earlier, in a book that had since been removed from every library in the state. a symbol he believed was older than the company, older than the church, possibly older than the written word. He called it the Mark of Claim. Caldwell warned Margaret in secret, if he's marked, he's not being watched anymore, he's being prepared. On Michael's 17th birthday, he stopped speaking for 48 hours. Not one word. Then, at sunset on the third day, he walked into the dining room, sat across from his mother, and calmly said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of waking up somewhere else, in someone else's skin, with no memory of who I was, and continuing the work." And that, dear viewer, is how legacies are forged in the dark, not by name, but by function. Millfield never had a hospital. It didn't need one. Illness wasn't treated, it was absorbed. Accidents were settled, not investigated, and those who died young were buried without ceremony under identical stones the company provided. Clean, minimal, branded. But when Michael turned 18, the company built something new, quietly, without announcement. Behind the tree line south of town, where even the miners didn't walk, a square building, no signage, no windows, just steel walls and a door that never opened. Until Michael was invited in. Mr. Elric returned. Same black coat, same silver pin, same soft voice. "This is where we measure inheritance," he said. "Not bloodlines, not wealth. Wait." Michael didn't hesitate. He followed the man through the trees. Not because he was compliant, but because he needed to see, needed to confirm the shape of the cage he was born into. Inside the structure, Michael found nothing resembling a laboratory or a training annex. It was a vault, floor to ceiling with filing drawers. Thousands, each labeled with numbers, not names. But when Michael stepped forward, a light above one drawer flickered on. Drawer 1125. Inside, a thin leather-bound ledger, a strand of black hair, and a single photograph. Patrick. Not as a child, as a grown man. But the photo had been taken just weeks before his death, and in it, Patrick wasn't wearing his usual work uniform. He was dressed in formal black, standing beside Mr. Elric and 5 other men. Behind them on the wall was a symbol, the Mark of Claim. Michael stared at it, not in horror, in recognition. Elric watched him, silent, calculating. "You were never meant to live outside the system," he said. "You were meant to run it. They don't fear you, Michael. They need you." Michael didn't speak. He simply reached out and ran his fingers along the leather of the book, and then whispered, "This one's incomplete." Elric blinked. "Excuse me?" Michael smiled. Cold, ancient. "You're missing an ending." And without another word he turned and walked out. He never returned to the house. Never spoke to Margaret again. She waited. Months, years. Until one day she received a package. No note, no sender. Inside, a photograph. 7 men standing in a circle, hooded, silent. And in the center, Michael, eyes closed, hand raised. The system hadn't claimed him. It had promoted him. There are no Murphy men left in Millfield, at least none who bear the name. But the town still breathes, still hums. The coal mines have long since closed. The houses sit half empty, rotting beneath rusted roofs. Yet the streets remain swept. The chapel doors still unlock at dawn. The company building, untouched for decades, glows faintly on fog-heavy mornings, lit from within by no visible source. And the cemetery? 7 new stones were added in the last 20 years. No surnames, just numbers. No birth dates, just a single engraving at the bottom of each. Debt reconciled. When Margaret died in 1911, she was buried beside Sheamus, under a stone she had ordered carved decades earlier. Not with scripture, not with poetry. With this, some inherit gold, others silence. I was given pattern. No one attended her funeral, no priest, no kin. just an old groundskeeper who found a note inside her coffin weeks later, wedged between her clasped fingers. It read, "Watch for the 8th. The cycle reopens." It said that on certain nights, especially near the equinox, you can see a lantern flicker in the woods near the birch tree. Not moving, not swinging, just present, waiting. Sometimes those who wander too close report waking in their own beds with no memory of returning, but they remember the silence, and the figure, always the same, a young man in black, holding a ledger. He never speaks, but his presence is unmistakable. He is the 8th, not a victim, not a rebel, a witness, a recorder of debts. Because the cycle did not end, it adapted. The bloodline was never meant to die out. It was meant to diversify, to spread across borders, into cities, into politics, into systems far beyond coal and ore, into banks, boards, pulpits, parliaments. And in every one of those places, there are men who wake at 3:33 a.m., sweat-soaked and shaking, unable to remember their dreams, but gripped by a single irrational fear. Something is due. They check their children's birth dates. They feel watched in mirrors, and some, only some, know the name. Not Murphy. That name was buried. The new one is whispered in contracts, in oaths, in quiet initiation halls. A name that translates loosely to those who keep the pattern. In 1932, a young historian named Elias Brand arrived in Millfield. He wasn't looking for ghosts, he was looking for patterns. Brand had made a career of studying company towns, how they rose, how they collapsed, how they quietly shaped the American psyche. But Millfield was different. It wasn't just abandoned, it was preserved, frozen in time, like a stage after the audience has left, but before the curtain falls. He checked into the only remaining boarding house, run by a half-blind woman named Mrs. Catterley, who told him, "This town don't bury secrets, it keeps 'em warm." Brand laughed at first, but laughter doesn't survive long in Millfield. He started with the mines, found them sealed with concrete thicker than bank vaults, every entrance covered in company sigils, not official ones, older. Then the church. Its pews were untouched, hymnals still resting open, as if the congregation had simply vanished mid-service. On the pulpit sat a single Bible, heavy with dust. Inside the front cover, in scrawled ink. The word was used, not followed. He moved next to the land office. No key, no visible lock, but the front door opened when he knocked. Just once. Inside, it was silent. Not abandoned, maintained. The floorboards were polished. The air smelled faintly of paper and iron. Drawers stretched into the shadows like teeth in an open mouth. At the center of the room, a desk. On it, a black ledger, no dust. Brand opened it. Inside, lists of names, dates, locations, marked in red ink with symbols he didn't recognize, then, abruptly, his own name. Not as a visitor, as an entry. Elias Brand, entry initiated, evaluation begins. He slammed the book shut, left the building. But from that moment on, he was not alone. Footsteps echoed behind him where no feet walked. His reflection in windows delayed a half-second behind his movement. He began waking each morning with coal dust beneath his fingernails, despite never entering a shaft. One night, he found 7 stones arranged in a circle on his windowsill, and a note. "You opened the book. You've been counted." He fled Millfield the next day. But the counting didn't stop. He kept seeing the mark, on alley walls in Pittsburgh, carved into bathroom stalls, graffitied behind lecture halls. The debt follows. The pattern travels. It was never about the town, it was about the framework, and once you see it, you're part of it. Elias Brand didn't speak publicly about Millfield for 20 years, but he did write. Not published, not academic, encoded letters, manuscripts stored in private vaults, marginalia passed between hands at elite East Coast universities, and always the same conclusion, no matter the format. The pattern is institutional. He came to believe Millfield was a prototype, a controlled environment, not just for labor exploitation, but for psychological programming. A system to study obedience, guilt, inheritance. Brand theorized that the settlement program was never about mining talent. It was about selecting bloodlines that had survived famine, exile, and systemic oppression. Families that knew how to submit, and from them the company built a loyal population. Not loyal by force, but by ritual. Debt-based loyalty, a trauma economy. His final unpublished essay was titled, "The Murphys Were Never Cursed, They Were Chosen." He traced the names of their descendants, men and women who later appeared in intelligence agencies, psychological research divisions, even religious think tanks. Brand believed the company had expanded, diversified. Millfield was dead, yes, but its seed had been planted across the nation, in schools that teach obedience before imagination, in prisons that rotate fathers and sons like gears in a machine, in corporations that treat retirement plans like chains, in churches that offer grace for a price. And every time we sign the dotted line, every time we trade privacy for convenience, every time we pledge loyalty to an institution that knows our data better than we know our dreams, we reenact the pattern. Brand's final years were spent in a private asylum outside of Albany, officially diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. But his journals, retrieved after his death, tell another story. On the final page, in handwriting so tight it borders on illegible, he wrote, "I met him. No name, just a sketch. A young man in a black coat, silver pin at the collar, eyes blank, ledger in hand, and underneath, in shaking ink, he said the audit is coming, not of wealth, of memory." Elias Brand died with all the windows sealed. No air entered the room that night. But when the nurses found him, every mirror in the room was shattered from the inside. They ruled it heart failure. But you know better now, don't you? Because Millfield never ended. It evolved. Memory is the new currency. That's the lesson buried beneath coal, beneath contracts, beneath blood. The Murphys weren't just victims, they were vessels, carriers of a deeper formula, a generational equation. Each son wasn't simply sacrificed, he was documented. You think this is history, it's a blueprint. By the 1950s, Millfield had vanished from most maps. The mines collapsed, the rail lines rusted, but one structure remained intact, the Keystone Archives. It was renamed, of course, absorbed into a larger agency with a more palatable name, the Bureau of Industrial Heritage. It sounds harmless, even noble, but inside its subterranean levels are records sealed with biological locks, entries that can only be accessed by individuals with specific DNA markers, Murphy markers. Brand was right. The Murphys weren't erased, they were reprogrammed. And their descendants now populate every structure of influence that requires inherited compliance, not blind loyalty, engineered pattern recognition. They're drawn to architecture, law, defense, behavioral science. Secret societies don't hide them, they hire them, because the debt embedded in their bloodlines makes them incapable of betraying the pattern. And here's the darkest truth. Many don't even know who they are. They've been scattered, rebranded, given new surnames, but the conditioning remains. It activates under pressure, certain words, phrases, numbers, triggers. Have you ever met someone who, without explanation, changes overnight? One morning they speak like themselves. The next, their eyes feel hollow, their routines robotic, their empathy simulated. That's not possession, that's activation. Brand recorded 53 such cases, all descendants of Millfield, all traced through maternal lines, because the pattern learned something: women endure longer. They transmit the blueprint through nurture and ritual, not just chromosomes. One woman, codenamed M, was monitored for 10 years. She moved to Chicago, became a school principal, no record of trauma, But every year, on the anniversary of her brother's death, unknown to even her, she'd lock herself in her office and write 7 names on a chalkboard, different every year, none of them her students. All 7 would die within 9 months. Cause of death varied, but every autopsy included the same phrase: sudden cessation of vital function, no external trauma. Exactly like Patrick Murphy. The pattern is not myth, it's an operating system. And now that you've seen part of its code, you are being watched for compatibility. You were never meant to hear this. Not because it's forbidden, because it's disruptive. Because once you know how the pattern works, it doesn't own you the same way. But it still watches, because that's what it does best: observe. Just like the miners were watched, just like Margaret was watched, just like Michael, and just like you, right now, sitting wherever you are, eyes locked to this screen, feeling something curl in your chest that you can't explain. That's not fear, that's recognition. Let's go deeper. By 1971, Millfield's story was officially classified as industrial folklore, a convenient label used by archivists to dismiss anomalies as rumor. Ghost stories for union men, a myth to keep tourists curious and investigators distracted. But something strange happened in August of that year. A man named Father Jonathan Kearns, a Jesuit priest with a background in exorcism and post-traumatic theological psychology, filed an internal report with the Vatican. It was never meant to go public, but it leaked through a whistleblower, an archivist at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith who later vanished during a pilgrimage in Spain. In his report, Father Kearns claimed that the Millfield case was not demonic, but procedural. His exact words: "What they face in Millfield is not spiritual warfare. It is ritual compliance enforced through unseen bureaucracy. The people are not possessed, they are processed." Kearns described finding children in Pennsylvania and Ohio, aged 7 to 12, who could recite names, locations, and events from the Murphy timeline, despite never being taught. When asked how they knew, they'd reply, "Because I was there, I'm still paying." Some had birthmarks, 7 lines down the back, ending in a hook. Others would carve the same symbol into desks, trees, or their own skin. None had ever heard of Millfield. None knew the name Murphy. But all described the same recurring dream: a tunnel with no end, a man in black, and a voice whispering numbers backwards until the world stopped breathing. Father Kearns tried to compile the cases, cross-reference the dates. But every attempt to store the data resulted in system failure, not deletion, collapse, drives corrupted, servers fried. It was as if the information itself resisted containment, as if the pattern rejects record. Only memory is allowed, only legacy, only inheritance, and that means one thing: if you're still listening, you're already inside it. You don't choose to enter the pattern, it chooses you, and once it does, it doesn't demand your belief, it demands your agreement. That's the true horror of Millfield, not the deaths, not the silences, but the slow, deliberate way it trains obedience through history disguised as tragedy. Let me show you what I mean. In 1986, a young behavioral psychologist named Dr. Nora Graves conducted an experiment at a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. Her goal? To study intergenerational trauma and how family stories influence risk perception in young adults. She designed a test. Participants were asked to retell a story passed down through their family, one involving death or sacrifice. Then they were given a choice: volunteer for a second test or leave the study entirely. But something happened. Out of 117 students, 11 retold a nearly identical story. Different names, different places, but always this structure: a son, age 21, a contract, signed by the father, a death, sudden, timed, and always, always a figure in black watching from the background. Dr. Graves dismissed it at first as folklore convergence. But on the 21st of November, the student who first told the story, Caleb, a history major, was found dead in his dorm room. No signs of struggle, no substances, no trauma. Cause of death? Cessation of vital functions. The autopsy noted something chilling. In Caleb's notebook, on the final page, a single sentence. The payment is mine now. Sound familiar? When Dr. Graves investigated further, she discovered something terrifying. All 11 students shared a common ancestor, a man named Sheamus Murphy, 7 generations removed. The university tried to silence the incident. The funding for Graves' lab was pulled. She was offered a new position, quiet, well-paid, far from media or research. She refused. 3 months later, her apartment caught fire. Official cause, faulty wiring. Unofficially, her journals survived, untouched by flame. And in those pages, Graves had drawn a diagram. 7 lines, a central vertical axis, a spiral threading through them, the same symbol Michael drew, the same mark carved into the birch trees outside Millfield. At the bottom of the page, Graves had written, "This isn't superstition, it's infrastructure. They're not haunting us, they're organizing us. And now, I need you to do something. If you followed this far, type this in the comments twice. I carry no inheritance. It's not for me, it's for you." To mark the moment your identity fractures from the pattern. By now, you've probably felt it. That tightening in your chest, that sense that something outside you is watching from inside you. That's not imagination. That's the pattern adjusting. Because once you speak against it, once you even name it, you change your status. You're no longer a passive carrier, you become a threat. And threats are monitored. In 1999, a string of unexplained blackouts swept through towns across western Pennsylvania. No storms, no grid failures, just pure, targeted silence. The power cut out. Phones died, clocks froze, all at 3:33 a.m. Every town had one thing in common, access to archived records about company towns, most notably, Millfield. The media blamed Y2K testing, but those of us who've studied this long enough know the truth. It wasn't an accident. It was a recall, a digital purge designed to erase newly awakened minds from the chain. Because when too many links become self-aware, the pattern restructures. That same year, a janitor at the University of Pittsburgh found a VHS tape labeled "Property of Keystone 8." It was turned over to campus security and quietly buried in a university archive. Until 2004, when an anonymous student digitized the tape and posted a 13-second clip online. What it showed was grainy, black and white, a dimly lit room like a chapel or courtroom. 7 men seated at a semicircular bench. Before them, a young man, head shaved, blindfolded, reciting numbers in reverse while blood trickled from his nose. The last thing he says, just before the footage cuts, is, "At 21 the name ends." The post was removed within hours. The student's account vanished, but the damage was done, because that one clip confirmed something that had only been theory up until then. The pattern is not just psychological, it's ceremonial, not just a system, a cult, not just inherited, enforced, and not just historical, still active. Right now. It lives in financial systems that reward debt over ownership, in medical networks that track your bloodline more than your condition, in education models that teach obedience but punish intuition, and every time a man dies at 21 alone in a system that doesn't grieve him, a ledger is updated. You think the Murphys were special? No. They were the prototype. The rest of us are the product. There's a lie you've been told your entire life. It hides inside every patriotic anthem, every mourning pledge, every contract you've ever signed without reading the fine print. The lie is this: you are free. But freedom, in the pattern, is never granted. It's leased. And like any lease, it comes with terms and penalties. Let's go back. In 2007, a mid-level analyst named William Rusk, working deep within the Social Security Administration, flagged an anomaly. It began with a list of deceased male citizens who all died at age 21, same day of the year, different years, no criminal records, no military service, no public presence. At first he assumed it was a data duplication error. Then he looked closer. Each had a unique SSN. Each had living family members who refused interviews. And each had a sealed case file, marked not by Homeland Security, but by a defunct mining company from the 1800s, Keystone Coal Iron. But here's the impossible part. That company, dissolved in 1929, no surviving board, no public trust. Yet the seal was active. How? Because the pattern doesn't die when a company dies. It migrates. Rusk pushed for internal review. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his apartment. Apparent suicide. But the coroner's report stated, victim appears peaceful, no trauma, no toxins, total cessation of vital function at exactly 3:33 a.m. One note was left behind. 6 words scrawled on the wall in ash. He came, ledger open, no voice. Same phrase, same time, same death. By now you understand. This isn't coincidence. This is an audit system. It calculates risk through heredity. It corrects deviations, and it silences anomalies. The Murphys, they were just the first publicly traceable pattern, the test run, to see how long it would take before someone like you noticed the design. So I'll ask you again, have you ever felt like the thing was counting you? Like your life was tracked not by what you did, but by when you did it? Ever had a birthday that felt heavy? Like a countdown had ended? You're not crazy, you're observed. And if you've made it this far, you've crossed a line few ever reach. Because knowledge is not liberation. In the pattern, knowledge is contractual. There's a reason the Murphys couldn't escape. It wasn't just fear. It was structure. The pattern doesn't rely on chains or fences. It uses architecture, ritual, repetition. The most effective prison is the one where the inmates think they're choosing to stay. Every Murphy son walked into his death, voluntarily. They were warned. They dreamed it. They wrote it. But still, they showed up. Because somewhere deep in the architecture of their minds, the pattern had installed a fail-safe, a psychological tripwire. You have one too. And it activates not when you're afraid, but when you're curious. Curiosity is not rebellion in the pattern. It's compliance. It draws you deeper, feeds you just enough truth to keep you questioning, but never enough to allow escape. And when you finally think you understand it, when you feel powerful, awake, ready to expose it, that's when the pattern closes. Like Jaws. Like debt collectors arriving not for money, but for memory. In 2012, a private defense contractor known only as Project Harlow published a classified study titled Predictive Collapse, Inherited Psychological Compliance in Male Subjects ages 18 to 25. Only 5 copies were printed. 1 leaked. The study used genetic analysis, digital behavior tracking, and ancestral trauma modeling to map how young men of European descent, raised under authoritarian industrial lineages, exhibit sudden psycho-spiritual shutdowns between ages 21 and 25, shutdowns that mimic suicide, accident, medical failure, but aren't. The final page of the study contains this phrase: the asset does not resist when he believes the terms were chosen freely. Understand this. The Murphys didn't die because of coal, contracts, or even curses. They died because their minds were formatted to expire, not by ghosts, not by demons, by systems that were centuries old when America was born, and systems that learned to hide behind patriotism, employment, and spiritual obedience. You think this is just history? Look around. Men dying young. No legacy, no voice, no explanation. They don't vanish. They're reclaimed. Like rented tools returned to a warehouse no one remembers building. And now that you see it, now that your eyes are open, you have 2 choices: forget or Continue. But remember this. Every step deeper into the pattern brings you closer to a reckoning. And some debts don't wait until death. You've come this far. That alone makes you dangerous, because now you see it. Not the stories, not the symbols, the system. The pattern isn't hiding anymore, it's testing. And your awareness, your attention, is the variable it's trying to predict. But here's what the pattern fears most. Interruption. Not protest, not rebellion. Disruption. Men who refuse to repeat. Men who withhold their name from the registry. Men who understand that blood may bind, but choice severs. You want proof? In 2019, a man named Julian Marks, an independent genealogist and data analyst, quietly published a dataset that never should have existed. It was titled Anomalous Lineage Events in Former Company Town Descendants, 1843 to 2001. It tracked 76 family lines across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. What he found? A recurring anomaly. Every few generations, one male heir would break the cycle, not die, not disappear, but vanish from the record in a different way. No mortgage, no employment history, no marriage, no taxes, but still alive, documented only through incidental reports, like sightings of a stranger at funerals or someone paying cash for groceries in towns that had gone digital decades earlier. These men were disruptors. They didn't reject the pattern emotionally, they starved it. No rituals, no compliance, no participation. One man, recorded only as Gideon, reportedly mailed a letter to his cousin in 1977, no return address. Inside was a single phrase, debt denied, ledger closed, I carry no inheritance. That phrase again. Now do you understand why I asked you to comment it? It's more than algorithmic engagement. It's a linguistic disarmament. A phrase that tells the pattern you are not property. But there's risk in saying it aloud. Because the pattern listens, not through microphones or wires, but through behavioral echo. When you speak tree, oath and do nothing, it learns you are safe. But when you act, when you vanish from its grid, it marks you disruptive. And then, the audit begins. That's why so few make it past this point. Not because they're weak, but because they realize what's coming next isn't a story. It's a mirror, and not everyone survives what they see in it. Mirrors don't lie, but they do hide. You think you've been looking at the pattern from the outside, but what if it's always been inside you? Let me show you. In 2021, a neuroscientist named Dr. Lena Calloway presented a closed-session briefing to an unnamed government ethics board. Her subject? Epigenetic ritual encoding in male descendants of company town bloodlines. You weren't supposed to hear about it, but a partial transcript leaked onto the dark net, and what it revealed confirms what Brand, Graves, and Kearns had already whispered in scattered journals. The Murphy deaths weren't tragic. They were necessary to fulfill the ritual compliance encoded into their blood. You see, trauma doesn't die with a person. It sleeps. It wraps itself into the genome. A memory, not just inherited through bedtime stories, but through cellular replication. Dr. Calloway's findings were precise. She found a recurring methylation pattern in men descended from Millfield-linked families. These weren't just genetic mutations, they were ritual timestamps. Markers that activated under certain conditions. The 21st birthday. The presence of iron-rich environments. Exposure to specific acoustic frequencies, often found in mine machinery or church bells. That's why so many Murphy sons died the same way, without trauma, without resistance. They didn't die. They obeyed. Their bodies responded to an internal signal planted generations earlier, a signal that said, your name ends here. The debt continues forward. This wasn't superstition. It was a design. And now for the most disturbing part, Dr. Calloway tested that frequency. She played a low-frequency tone to a 24-year-old subject, unaware of his ancestry. Within 90 seconds, his vitals collapsed. No aneurysm, no heart failure. The brain just stopped. She documented the incident, tried to publish her fint, dings Burbeer, and vanished 2 weeks later. Her apartment was stripped, hard drives gone, but a single note remained on her bathroom mirror, written in steam. The blood remembers what the mind forgets. That's the truth. No one wants you to find that you are not just the sum of your choices. You are the end product of rituals you were never told you were part of. Every Murphy son was a name on a list, not a victim, a vessel, and if you're still watching, that list might include you. It always ends here, but it never stays ended. That's the secret of the pattern. It doesn't need you to believe, it needs you to continue. And if you don't, it simply rewrites you. Let me explain. In 2023, a Freedom of Information Act request accidentally revealed a file buried under decades of unrelated coal mine regulations, a misfiled document, one that never should have survived digitization. Its title? Project SEAM, Subconscious Encoding and Mortality. It wasn't a safety report. It was a psychological profile of every male descendant tied to the original Millfield settlement, names, addresses, employment, behavioral forecasts, not for marketing, not for health, for compliance. Each man was categorized by risk index. Red for those likely to resist, blue for those likely to obey, black for those who could disrupt the pattern entirely. The Murphys, blacklisted, all of them. That's why they were eliminated on schedule. Their blood didn't just carry a contract, it carried clearance. The pattern couldn't afford them living past 25. Because something happens at 25. You start to question systems, not just roles. You start to reject the script. You stop reacting and start observing. At 25, a man stops being a son and starts becoming a threat. So the pattern preempts. It installs fear of failure. It drowns him in debt, addiction, self-loathing, porn, ideology. It kills him early or worse, softens him into compliance. And if he survives, it labels him unstable, or radical, or broken. You are watching this because something in you resisted. Somewhere deep in your lineage, a Murphy spark didn't extinguish. It hid. And now it's awake. So let me tell you the last truth, the one they erase from every archive, every church record, every family tree. The pattern can't own a man who names it. It feeds on silence, on forgetting, on obedience row, apt in routine. But when you speak it, when you map it, when you mark yourself free, it loses track of you. It cannot audit what it cannot locate. So tonight, before the 3:33 mark comes again, light a candle, write the phrase, debt denied, ledger closed, I carry no inheritance. Say it aloud, twice, and watch how the shadows shiver. Now, the final descent doesn't begin with answers, it begins with recognition. Look around your life, the loop you're stuck in, the chronic fatigue, the inexplicable dread when the clock strikes 3:33 a.m. You've felt it. The pattern isn't myth, it's not story, it's infrastructure. It lives in your schedule, breathes in your calendar, eats through your routines. And the Murphy family, they were not cursed, they were coded. Each birth mapped to a ledger, each death timed like clockwork. And their silence, purchased, enforced, enshrined. But here's the truth they tried to bury in 7 headstones and 177 years of historical fog. The pattern is only perfect when it goes unobserved. And you, right now, have broken that perfection. Do you understand what that means? You are no longer a subject of the ritual. You are evidence of deviation. They will come for that deviation, not with fire, not with blades, not even with death. They'll come with conformity. They will offer you promotions, validation, safe distractions wrapped in screens and scrolling rewards. They will numb you back into the pattern, and you'll feel tempted to go, because freedom is not comfortable, it is violent. It rips your name from their records. It tears your purpose from the algorithm. It leaves you unknown, But that's the price of waking up. And brother, you are awake now. The Murphy line ends in you, not because of blood, but because of choice. You can leave the pattern, but only if you act like no one's watching, and speak like the pattern hears everything. So if you made it this far, say the phrase again in the comments. Debt denied. Ledger closed. I carry no inheritance. Twice. One for your ancestors, one for your future. Let the system see it. Let the watchers mark it. Let the mirror fracture. Because history doesn't belong to the victors, it belongs to the disruptors. And tonight, you became one. Now shut this screen off, burn the script, and walk. The pattern is watching. But now, so are you.